The following is a conversation with Dr. Karl Otto. He's the CEO of Limbus AI, a company that builds machine learning-based software for radiation therapy. Karl's career focus has been on developing radiation therapy technology that has a high clinical impact. He's sometimes referred to as Mr. VMAT due to his development of Volumetric Modulated Arc Therapy, which was the basis for Varian's RapidArc treatment planning and delivery system. VMAT is now the most common form of radiation treatment globally and is used to treat over 100,000 patients daily. Karl has explored several pathways in his career as a medical physicist, including clinical practice, academic research, and industry. In his current role at Limbus AI, he leads the team in developing AI-based organ segmentation software that is used in over 200 clinics and for segmenting over 250,000 scans annually. All right, so Karl, you have invented something in the past known as VMAT, Volumetric Modulated Arc Therapy, for radiation treatment in cancer patients. Basically, what is VMAT and why was this such a major advancement in the field of cancer treatment?
Yeah, so VMAT, what is VMAT? I think before I start talking about that, it might be good to give a little bit of background about what kind of radiation treatments were being delivered and planned at the time that VMAT was invented. Mm-hmm. So the goal in radiation therapy, the game in radiation therapy is to give a high dose of radiation to the tumor while giving as little dose as possible to the surrounding healthy tissue. One of the nice things about radiation therapy is it's non-invasive. So you don't need to kind of open the patient up like in a surgery to access the tumor. However, it is impossible to give 100% of the dose to the tumor and 0% of the dose to the healthy tissue. So there's always going to be some trade-off there. So around the time that I was working on VMAT, a few years previous to that, a new technology had been introduced called intensity modulated radiation therapy. And this technique was special because you could use computer algorithms for optimization that would optimize the intensity of different radiation beams that would be coming in from different directions and focused on the tumor.
So I'm just going to pause you there for those who aren't familiar with radiation treatment. So when someone's getting treated, they fire basically, it's not quite like a pencil diameter, but it's a beam that fires through the patient. So as it goes through the patient, it blast through all the tissue. Obviously you can't stop the beam early or something. You can only fire it at different positions. Is that a correct statement?
Yeah, that's correct. So that's why you can't give zero dose to the healthy tissue. It's inherent in the process that there's going to be some radiation that is hitting important healthy tissue structures like spinal cord, for example. It's a sensitive structure. You could paralyze the patient if you give them too much radiation dose. So a tumor that's really close to the spinal cord, you have to be really careful not to hit the spinal cord. And every patient is different too. Like every tumor has a different size, shape, position in the body. Different healthy tissue structures will have different positions in each patient, not by a lot, by a little bit. And enough that when you want to be precise down to around 1 millimeter, you have to customize the radiation treatment for each patient. So you can't just plan prostate cancer treatment once and apply it to every patient. Every single patient needs their own customized treatment. So this new technology called intensity modulated radiation therapy, or IMRT, was designed to optimize for each individual patient the radiation beams to give a high dose to the tumor.
Before that, it was just the same for everybody.
And before that, there was some kind of shaping of the radiation beam from each direction so that it would create like an aperture that would only focus on the tumor. But still, that was still pretty limited and wasn't nearly as good as this new technique, IMRT. The big trade-off with IMRT, though, was it took longer to treat patients. So although we had this great new technology that was beneficial to patients, we could only use it on a subset of patients just because it simply took too long to treat each patient. So only certain patients, usually head and neck patients, some prostate patients, would get the benefit of this kind of treatment. So it was kind of a problem in that we would have to hire a lot more people, build a lot more radiation bunkers, and buy a lot more machines that are multiple millions of dollars in order for all patients to be able to benefit from this technology. And that just wasn't feasible.
And they really
So
are bunkers too. Like that must be very expensive to build a new treatment center because you got blocks of cement, like, meters thick, huge walls, and big old doors as
definitely.
well. So yeah.
Yeah, no, it's very expensive. It's highly specialized, so it's quite expensive just because of that. And radiation therapy staff are not cheap either. So yeah, it just really wasn't feasible to be able to treat all patients. Another technology that was being introduced at that time was called image-guided radiation therapy, where you would take images of the patient just before they were treated. And that was great because you could make sure that each time a patient was treated, the radiation beams were set up very precisely on where the tumor is. And just a little bit more background, patients don't normally get their full radiation dose in one single shot. It's usually delivered over multiple treatments. So for prostate cancer, you can have 35 or 40 treatments over multiple days. So over that time, the patient might move, things might change within the patient, so that you want to really position it properly every single day to get that level of 1 millimeter or 2 millimeter precision. Anyways, that new technology was great, but it also took more time. So another reason, why few patients couldn't really access these great new technologies. So I think the general consensus at the time was that IMRT had these benefits, but it was just an inherent trade-off that it was going to take more time to treat patients. However, and this was back in like 2003 or so, I decided, well, I decided to check, basically do some simple back of the envelope calculations. Is there any technical reason why we could not treat a patient much faster? So, these head and neck treatments might take 20 minutes per treatment. And as I said, they have multiple treatments over multiple days. Maybe we can bring that down to something faster, maybe like 2 minutes.
So why did that take so long to treat them? 20 minutes with the beam.
It's mainly because, well, there's a few factors, but one reason is it was not using the output of the radiation machine very efficiently. That was partly due to, this gets very technical, but the intensity patterns that were generated by these optimizers would be, in order to generate them, you had to use multiple radiation beams from each beam direction that were quite inefficient to deliver. Basically very small apertures that were overlapping each other until you could build up this intensity distribution that was part of the optimization. Another reason is that you had like 7 beam directions or more that you would deliver the treatment. So you would have to like set up the beam in one direction, deliver all of these multiple fields, multiple subfields to generate the intensity, go to the next one, then go to the next one, and so on.
So it was very discrete. It was moving the beam at a certain place,
Yeah.
zapping, and then moving to the next position.
Yeah, I mean, it was fairly static. So yeah, so that's a good segue into, what I was trying to figure out. Like imagine if the radiation machine could deliver the treatment while everything was moving at the same time. So imagine the radiation beam source could be moving around the patient, and the aperture device could be moving simultaneously, and we could be changing the intensity of the radiation all at the same time. And if you had that capability and you moved everything at close to its maximum speed, so you rotated the beam as quickly as you could, you tried to use the maximum intensity of radiation as much as possible, and you also moved the aperture shaping device, which is called the multi-leaf collimator or MLC. If you made those things all move really quickly, could you actually deliver a treatment faster? Like, is there any physical reason why you couldn't? And through some simple calculations, you can, and looking at how we were treating patients with IMRT and how much like modulation of the intensity we needed, it wasn't showing that this should be a problem. Like, it should be possible. The challenge, though, even though it is, theoretically possible, how do you create an optimization algorithm that is capable of still delivering a very conformal, like very precise dose to the tumor, when everything's moving simultaneously. It's a really tricky optimization problem.
Right. Right. It's almost like going from something like discrete math where everything is separate beam positions and you do a calculation, and it's like it makes me think of almost like a probability distribution that is discrete versus a probability distribution that's continuous. And
Yeah.
so as soon as you start dealing with continuous functions, you deal with calculus and you deal with all the tools and fun stuff there. And so, in terms
Yeah.
of the mathematics of what went into this continuous beam planning, was it difficult? I mean, do you enjoy that sort of stuff?
I love to try to solve problems. I mean, it's solving problems with computers. It's a bit like a video game to me.
Yeah.
And that video game could last years. But if I'm getting towards my goal, if I'm progressing, then I'm comfortable. Even if it might take a really long time, if I'm progressing, and I know that if I succeed, the benefits will be substantial, then that can keep me going for years. It's really not a problem.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the main the main specific issue with going from IMRT to VMAT was for IMRT, you could actually separate the optimization of the intensities from how it was delivered. But with VMAT, you could not separate those anymore. So you had to think about how you're actually going to be able to create those on the machine as you're doing the optimization. So basically it's like what you were saying with the discrete math. It's, but that if you want to, specify exactly, what I had to worry about when I was coding this, that was it.
What was the most challenging part about writing these algorithms? Was there a specific type of math you had to go and read about that you were unsure of? Was there?
I mean, this is it. There wasn't any like really fancy math involved, to be honest. I'll tell you, I mean, the biggest challenges were setting up the problem in the first place. That's number one. So when I say that, setting up the problem, how do I had to basically write my own treatment planning system in order to start even looking at what the issues were with this. I could only go so far with my back of the envelope kind of thought experiment. I had to actually start writing the dose calculation engine for rotating beam or arc based delivery, which required you to calculate lots of beams, like 180. In fact, I was using 360 beams for like a single treatment. At that time, people were only calculating like 7 to 9 beams. So, that's more than an order of magnitude more. It's like, 40 times more beams or something. Anyway, in order to do that, you had to change the way that dose was calculated so you could do it fast enough. And my dose calculation engine wasn't very accurate, but it didn't really need to be super accurate. It just needed to model, what could potentially be delivered by radiation beams. That's not a great explanation, but basically I didn't need to, I wasn't going to like spend a lot of time making a super accurate dose calculation. I just wanted a test bench, right? For what I was going to really focus on, which was the optimization. So that took like a year to build that.
I almost wonder if that sort of wall that you hit, where in order to even set up the problem, you had to do all this coding and that risk involved there as well, that, you really want to test a frontier of something really new and novel. And I suspect that for a lot of people, something like that, where you have to put in a lot of effort and do a lot of coding before you can even start to solve the problem, is really maybe where people hit the wall, that there's this big, I don't know, like
this, big hurdle you have to get over, or big, like,
and you don't know what's on the other side. It could be just garbage and maybe it doesn't work. And
that's totally true.
Yeah.
And, I wasn't, even if I built this new way of calculating dose that was fast, it wasn't accurate enough to be used with, routine patients. So it would have just kind of been mothballed, right? I mean, it wasn't like, if I build this, I can use it anyways, right? For something. No, this was the sole purpose of building that treatment planning system.
So you built the treatment planning system, and then that's what led into the development of VMAT and the technique to actually optimize dose.
Well, yeah, that allowed me to kind of understand what the real issues were, right? Understand where I was going to hit roadblocks in terms of the optimization. Like, could I use a gradient-based optimization technique for this? I didn't know. Like, I thought it was unlikely, but I needed to try it. And turns out, no, you can't. It's so nonlinear. If you only have to optimize intensities, it's quite linear, and you can just, that's why, IMRT was a lot easier to optimize than VMAT. But because I have to worry about how the aperture is shaping in real time, like you have these apertures, and for people that are only listening, they're not going to be able to see my hands here, but imagine you've got like a shape that is optimal from one beam direction, and then from the next 1 degree of rotation, so the next beam, which is delivered 1 second later, the shape is supposed to be completely different, right? There's no way you can change the shape of the beam that quickly. So there has to be restrictions imposed on how quickly that shape can change. In fact, that shape can only change by around like 5 millimeters between each one of those beam directions. And that imposes a pretty strict constraint on what you're able to achieve. And in like optimization speak, it means it's riddled with local minima. So local minima are bad for optimization. That means the optimization is getting stuck. So it would just get stuck very quickly. And the treatment plans I was creating, the doses I was able to predict that I could deliver were really terrible with gradient-based optimization. So I started looking at other methods, and I started looking at more stochastic methods. So methods where you just kind of, instead of going down a specific optimization gradient, I won't get into the details of that. You basically just try random shapes. You just try lots of random shapes over like a very long period of time and see what you could come up with. And this is in my VMAT paper, actually. I compare that technique to the eventual technique that I developed. And although it didn't get stuck, it would still take, days or weeks before you'd actually come up with a decent treatment plan. And even after, I remember running it for weeks, and it didn't do as well as the technique that I eventually came up with. So, yeah.
Wow, weeks to run. I mean, this is something that in the modern era with computers now, people don't understand what weeks of running looks like.
That's right.
So you developed VMAT, and you published a paper on it. What was the initial reception in the community like when publishing VMAT?
Yeah, so I didn't publish anything on this before I published kind of I don't know if you'd call it the seminal paper on VMAT that basically just said, here it is, it works, and this is why, and most academics would probably write a couple of papers leading up to that to explain some of the developments that I made along the way. Unfortunately, I'm not a very good academic. I'm kind of lazy when it comes to writing papers. So I just waited till it was all done and then wrote a paper on it. So because of that, and I wasn't very well known in the community at that time either, in the scientific community, I think there was a bit of like surprise from some individuals, thinking that nobody had really showed that this could work, but all of a sudden it works. That discontinuity in research doesn't usually happen. What else? I mean, I think some people just dismissed it because they thought it just didn't work and I was making it up or something. But I mean, we can start talking about this too, but around the same time, I was also working with industry, and they were already trying to commercialize it. So there were clinics that were actually, when that paper came out, they were already looking at implementing it and are testing it and showing that it did in fact work. So that kind of, that helped lend credibility to the research because it was going to be used imminently on patients. And then, of course, eventually people did realize it worked, and now it's being used as a pretty common form of treatment.
That's an interesting dichotomy of, you have the people who see it, and you almost can't blame them in some ways if they're big names in the field, and there's this new guy and he comes along and he just revolutionizes a treatment that's been happening for so long. But that human tendency to want to resist something new like that versus in the industry, you were saying people wanted to get this, they saw the potential in this new treatment plan. And obviously this is not a characterization of the scientific field and the industrial field, but in terms of this one isolated case, I find it insightful to see how the reception was different. The people that really want to push to implement it in a clinical setting in the sort of industrial scale. I find that really awesome.
Yeah. I mean, I guess there were some unique characteristics about the technology that like allowed it to be implemented pretty quickly. I mean, you could actually like most of the work was software. It was optimization of the existing machine, the existing linear accelerator. So you could implement it fairly quickly using existing radiation therapy delivery technology, which meant that, you know, it wasn't like you had to start another company or build a new factory to build a new machine. The machines were already there. You know, we could talk about this a bit if you'd like, about the commercial aspects of how I, you know, presented it to the company that licensed it, and how, you know, I showed them that it actually worked on their machine in the factory when I first presented it to them, which was very, very powerful because, you know, they realized, wait a minute, we can start selling the software and our machine can do that. Our machine that already exists can start doing this.
That's really cool to actually, because that's sort of a union of, it's their machine, it's their old hardware, and you're saying, hey, I can integrate this new thing that I've developed and put it right on your machine. And I feel like, I guess that's the beautiful thing about software is it's in essence cheap. It doesn't cost them money to, well, in terms of maybe man hours and people coding, of course, and things like that. But in terms of designing hardware and updating everything that needs to be done, it can just be done right away on their current machine. That's really awesome.
I think for that reason, it was particularly valuable to them. I mean, having said that, you know, they did kind of drop everything at the company. This was Varian Medical Systems, and, you know, the CEO was very excited about it, and I think he had the vision that, you know, this is the way they should be going right away, right? Like, not just, oh, we should do this someday. No, we have to do this now. So I really got the impression that they kind of dropped a lot of other projects and said, this is what we're going to work on right now, and we're going to get this out as soon as possible. Because after I licensed it to them, it was not that long after, like maybe a year, that they were announcing it at the Astro conference in Los Angeles.
So what was their motivation in pushing it so hard? And I guess this sort of leads into, like, when moving from the older technique to VMAT, what were the biggest differences? And I guess there's multiple domains here you could talk about, but the first one I guess we could go into is from the perspective of the actual company that develops these radiation beams. What was it that was so special about VMAT that they wanted to implement right away?
Right. That's a great question. And I think it also is interesting to talk about this in the context of timing. And when you're developing new technology, new software, whatever it is, timing is so critical. Depending on what the market forces are at the time, you may come up with some great idea, and if it's not the right time, nobody will be interested. And then 5 years later, it'll be, you know, super important. It's really hard it can be hard to predict that. In my case, I was very lucky because there was a company called Tomotherapy, a startup company that had a new way of delivering the treatment that was also rotating the beam around the patient. It was different though, in that, you know, my technique, you could treat the patient in 1 or 2 rotations around the patient, but their technique required, it was like a CT scanner kind of, and it would require many rotations around the patient. It was actually, you know, normally slower than the conventional IMRT treatment. However, the dose distributions you could create were very nice, very conformal to the tumor, to whatever you're targeting, and then reducing dose to healthy tissue. Anyways, this was a company, startup company, and they were starting to, I believe, they were starting to take customers away from the biggest radiation therapy company, Varian. So Varian was, I think, concerned about tomotherapy. Um, and they didn't have an answer to what they were doing. Really, there was like, okay, well, we have our machine that does IMRT. It's a little bit faster than tomotherapy, but tomotherapy has shown, other benefits. So, people were really excited about tomotherapy. So this is where the timing comes in. I walk through the door, say, hey, look, guys, we can do a technique that is very similar to tomotherapy. It's rotational therapy. It's way faster than tomotherapy. And in some cases, it may be not quite as good as tomotherapy, but in some cases, it's a little better than tomotherapy. So they, this was like the answer to their concerns, right? Give people like a good business reason to do something, and they'll do it. They'll jump on it. So because of that, I mean, that's probably the main reason that they just, pushed it forward so quickly.
Right. This is one of these, and obviously something like capitalism is capable of lots of evils in any system of economics. But in this example, it really shows the positive power of something like capitalism, where you have the competing interests of two companies driving a new technology that helps patients in the end. And again, that's not saying that, the industrial way is necessarily the way to go, but it really shows a positive example in my mind of capitalism in its true good working form to benefit people who need to get treatment for cancer or who need, anything in that sort of domain. So that it's awesome to see that, you have these two competing companies, and through competition, you develop these new technologies, and that's the driving fire, I guess, that really, the people in, for example, the company you mentioned that made them really want to get VMAT out there was, well, there's another competitor and they're doing it pretty good too, and we need to do it even better. And so I, as someone who likes competition myself, I grew up doing a lot of sports and stuff. I like that mindset of, all right, well, they're doing a good job, we got to do better, and then it ultimately benefits the patient.
I mean, I think it's a fair question to ask. Like, if tomotherapy had not existed, would Varian have pushed VMAT forward so quickly? Like, if they were already selling conventional IMRT and making a lot of money off of it, there would be no real push for them to work on VMAT. So eventually it would have come out, but I doubt it would have come out as quickly as if they, in a scenario where they didn't have that pressure.
Yeah, it's like, who is the hero without the adversary? You make each other stronger. Not that tomotherapy is the adversary here.
And it's also good for the cost of this stuff too, right? I mean, if somebody has a monopoly, then they can just charge whatever they want. But as long as there's other companies around offering competing technology, people are forced to reduce prices and make things cheaper and keep it cheaper for cancer patients ultimately.
Yeah. Which is the most important. So obviously this marketing project was very successful. VMAT made its way into clinics where they treat hundreds of thousands of people a day. Personally, yourself, how did the success of, you were a grad student, like me, you don't get paid great, but you can live a decent life. But how did you, with all that success, how did you manage, I guess, to stay sane? I know success can.
Well, I don't know. Like, I don't believe I've changed that much. And yeah, I was, a graduate student. I never got any scholarships. So I was always, trying to figure out how to pay for my studies. And I was never a really great student. Right. So, I mean, it was a humongous shock to me how successful VMAT was. I didn't expect it to be that way. Like I told you, I felt like I was playing video games when I was developing it. I guess I like to think, like, why did I do it in the first place? And I think I honestly was not very happy with my job as a medical physicist. I felt like, and maybe this was just, daydreaming a little bit, but I felt like I wanted to try to have an impact. I wanted to just give it a shot, right? At least once in my career to just really see if I could do something important. And for that reason, when I worked on VMAT, I was only working half time. I was only getting paid half time. I had to do it on my own time. Nobody would give me money to work on that. So I was taking a financial risk in addition, to maybe research or academic risk. If this didn't go anywhere, it would have been a waste of time. Wouldn't be able to get grants and that kind of thing. And I think that it's almost good to not be happy sometimes, to force you into trying different things, right? Get out of your comfort zone. So, to answer your question though, like, it was a roller coaster ride because it kind of took off really quickly. I mean, a year after I'd licensed it to Varian, I was giving talks for them, all over the world. I was still in my mid to early 30s. So, still pretty young guy. I was also making pretty good money from the royalties of the license, and those just increased over time. So financially, that was also very new for me. Like I didn't really have any money before that. So that was obviously really nice too. But as soon as VMAT was kind of winding down for me, so I had been working on it for many years, but for a lot of other people, this was totally new. I was getting a little bit tired of it, to be honest. It had enough. It was working. I knew it worked. And it's time to do something else.
It's like George Washington in American history. I don't know why this brings up that example, but stepping down when your time is over and passing the baton to the next person.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's like that, but
well,
I mean, I did decide, like, I did want to I did want to kind of quote, keep it real. And what I actually did is, when things were winding down for me, I mean, VMAT was just taking off at that time. I went and I moved to Seattle, and I worked for a consulting group in Seattle, a medical physics consulting group. And I wanted to enjoy and experience the last kind of step of VMAT, which was being involved in clinical implementation. So this consulting group I was involved with, they had routine clinical work, but they also were doing commissioning work for VMAT at any new clinic that was getting it. So I kind of took that on, and I would actually go to a clinic and commission VMAT for them. I would, with the measurement phantom and the ion chambers and, whatever, film dosimetry, regardless of what other, QA method they had, I would commission it for them and make sure the treatment planning system was working and get that final step of, like, it implemented in the clinic, because I was capable of doing that. I'm a former clinical physicist. And I just wanted to see what that was like. And that was kind of rewarding, because this is something that I had started from scratch, and now I'm there when they treat the first patient on it in several clinics.
So the whole process of this brick wall that you hit, where you had to build that software to do dosimetry like calculations, all the way to the first implementation in the clinic and seeing it reach its final point. That's really cool.
Yeah. The only thing that was a bit weird about that was I would show up at some, small clinic with only one or two radiation machines. And I'd usually be there with a colleague from this consulting group called Northwest Medical Physics. And I would explain to them, oh yeah, I invented this. I invented VMAT, and now I'm going to commission it at your small clinic. And it's being implemented all over the world. And I'd get these funny looks, like, you're either insane or there's something else is wrong with you. Because, like, what are you doing at my small clinic to actually commission this thing that I bought from Varian for X, tons of money?
I think something is right with you for doing that. I think that's really cool to actually see it in its form in the clinic. Before we move on to other topics, in terms of the patient side of why VMAT is so important, and the clinic and treating as many people as possible, what was the biggest impact with the implementation of VMAT, both on, I know this is maybe a difficult question, but on patient outcome? So did it treat their cancer better? That's an obvious question for someone who is getting cancer treatment. And then also in terms of optimizing how many people can get treated, because of course in the the hospital setting, you're not just concerned, well, are people getting better, but also can we treat enough people when there's like long wait lists and stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure exactly which treatment sites in the body benefit most from VMAT. I think lung treatments, especially stereotactic body radiation therapy treatments of lungs. So those are like very high doses, where very high precision. Those are beneficial with VMAT. I mean, most I think almost all prostate cancer patients are treated with VMAT because there's significant benefits to reducing dose to the rectum and not having like as many hot spots in healthy tissue.
When you refer to hotspots, you're talking about the traditional brachytherapy, right?
No, when I say hotspots, I mean like some of these optimization algorithms, in order to achieve their goals, they will have to put like some additional amount of radiation in healthy tissue, usually where there's not a very sensitive structure, but still you want to avoid those if possible. VMAT does a better job of kind of spreading out the dose so that you have lower doses everywhere rather than, spikes of spikes of dose that are in the healthy tissue. Mm-hmm. But going back to the time issue, though, there's one thing I didn't mention about the benefits of time. So beyond being able to treat more patients, being able to get the radiation dose into the tumor quickly has other advantages in terms of precision and accuracy. So as I mentioned, this new technique called image-guided radiation therapy was being introduced. So they would take images of the patient just before they're being treated. And then as soon as they take those images, they try to line up the patient as well as they can. And then they turn on the radiation beams and get the dose into the cancer area, the target. However, depending on what you're treating, and especially cases in the pelvis and abdomen where we're quite mushy and things can move around in very short time frames, getting the radiation dose into the target quickly has advantages, because over a period of like 10 to 20 minutes, there's a greater probability that, for example, your prostate would move around. Let's say you're treating the prostate, would move around versus getting the radiation dose in only 2 minutes.
Right.
So because of that, there's a better chance that you will actually treat the patient more accurately and more precisely so that you will not miss the tumor. And of course, if you do miss the tumor, there's a chance that the cancer will not be treated properly, and the patient won't be cured, and the cancer might come back more quickly. And also, if you miss the tumor and actually hit the healthy tissue instead, then there's an increased chance of complications and side effects due to that treatment.
Yeah, I mean that's the issue with radiation, I guess, is that it both treats but can also induce cancer if not done properly. So it's
yeah, I mean, most of the side effects are not cancer induction. A lot of the patients are quite old. It's usually inflammation of the tissue, damage to the tissue that can cause other kind of problems. But yeah, so another thing too is just the comfort for patients like this. Getting radiation treatment, it's obviously nicer than getting like surgery, but for some treatments, particularly like head and neck treatment, where you have to wear a mask that kind of glues you down to the treatment couch for your treatment. If you have to be under this thing for like half an hour, strapped into the treatment couch while everything's kind of moving around, and it's this kind of scary procedure. Obviously, you're going to be a lot happier, and it'll be a lot more comforting if you can get that done in 2 minutes instead of 20 minutes.
Of course. I don't know if I would last 20 seconds without being strapped in. That's quite terrifying. And you're right, that reduction in time has to be huge for patient comfort in those settings.
Yeah, I mean, I've had lots of people come up to me and say that they love VMAT just because of that benefit, right? Doesn't even have an additional therapeutic effect, but just making the patients happier. I mean, it is a significant factor just to having happier patients. Having cancer really sucks, and you're dealing with a lot of stuff. It's quite uncomfortable, painful. There's a lot of side effects for every kind of cancer. There's some different kind of side effects, and if you have to like if you can be made more comfortable, I think patients really appreciate it.
Of course. Of course. All right. So a lot of people watching this, and I kind of want to shift directions here. I want to give people inspiration, who are watching this, who like to code themselves and who are probably doing university degrees in things like physics, math, engineering, all the regular sort of coding stuff. When you were a young person, you're still a young person, but when you were younger and in college, what was your undergraduate degree?
So I actually did physics and atmospheric science. And
Ah.
now, no, I so I went into physics. I wasn't exactly sure. I almost went into engineering, but I really liked physics. I found it super interesting, but I also had no intention of doing anything beyond an undergraduate degree at that time. And I wanted to have something that I could maybe fall back on. So I knew that you could get some jobs in atmospheric science, weather prediction, that kind of thing. So I decided, what the heck? There's only, 6 or 8 more courses I would have to take to get a joint major with this other field. So I did that. Totally regretted it. I did not enjoy it. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it at all. It just wasn't for me. But that was a mistake. I seriously wish I had done a joint major with physics and computer science. That would
Hmm.
have been far more appropriate for me. But I didn't see it at the time. I didn't even, and in terms of medical physics, so after my undergrad was finishing up, I wasn't sure what I was going to do next. Getting a job, I didn't want to work in atmospheric science, and I didn't. Getting a job just after an undergraduate physics degree could be tricky. You're not really trained to do anything, specific. Basically, when I think back at undergraduate physics, what you're trained to do is solve problems, figure out solutions to problems. I mean, every
Hmm.
physics assignment is just solving some kind of problem. You're given some kind of parameters, some equations, some, you know, physical laws, and you're said, okay, well, given the physical laws and this under these conditions, what's going to happen?
Hmm.
So I think, and those skills are extremely useful in life, but also in any kind of like technical computer programming.
I remember I took this third year E&M course, one of my favorite courses I ever took. It was with the professor, Dr. Mark Laidlaw from UVic. I don't know if he's watching, but if he is, I really enjoyed that course. And one thing about that course that inspired me for research was that he wouldn't just ask questions like in a regular physics course where here's the parameters of your system, use the equations and solve it. The problems were very open ended and required you to think, go, write some code, and it wasn't so obvious what the solution was. So I remember one of the assignments, it had to do with dropping a magnet through a loop of wire. We did it in a lab and we collected data, and as the magnetic field through the coil changes, the current through the coil changes, and you measure that data and you can plot it, and it's kind of qualitative. But then he said, okay, for the assignment, I want you to model what's happening here. And that was the first time I had ever been asked a problem where there was no equation. Well, there's some equations obviously to go off of, but there wasn't a clear direction of, well, you have to ask the question, well, what is the magnet? How do I model the magnetic field from this cylindrical bar magnet? How do I get the measurements on this magnet? How do I go to the loop? And you have to go back to the lab and measure everything and come up with how you're going to fit the data to get the physical parameters of the system. It was a whole exercise that I had never really been through before. And I feel like a lot of physics sometimes is here's the problem, here's the solution, and not enough of here's an open-ended problem. Case in point, VMAT, establishing the whole software there. It's not asked in a way that's easy to even know where to begin.
Right, right. That sounds really, really cool. Actually, the way your professor was presenting you with that. I mean, having to think through how to actually model it. It's almost like it brings it closer to reality. Like I don't know if it was the same for you, but the later years of my undergrad, when you're learning about relativity and quantum mechanics, it becomes harder to relate that to everyday life, right? In fact, it's pretty much impossible. And eventually it's just like, okay, these are rules of a game we have to learn, and this is how the universe actually works. But to, really think about what this means, like for me, it was very difficult to just do thought experiments and really understand what the heck was going on with those kind of advanced physics topics. But yeah, the experiment you're talking about, that forces you to really think about what is really going on, like what is happening. And like you get just a more fundamental understanding of what these forces, what these, forces, what the magnetic field actually mean.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's really cool.
And even how to take, like, there's this weird boundary you reach in physics where you can, in high school, you're given equations and you plug in numbers to formulas, which is so boring. And I wasn't a big fan of it either. But you reach this point where you're actually interfacing between reality, like you're going to a lab and you're physically dropping something and you're collecting data and then relating that to mathematics. And that experience isn't easy to get access to if you're always guided through the steps. There's something about going through the, darkness the first time and really figuring it out that, at least for me, in terms of research, that was probably one of the most influential things I've ever done.
I think it's clear that we were not destined to be theoretical physicists.
No. But in terms of coding, did you do much coding when you were an undergrad?
Not really. I took one course in my first year, which I did, okay on, but nothing special. We programmed in Pascal. Mm-hmm. If you've ever even heard of that language now, I don't know, but
it rings a bell.
It's like caveman language. Anyway, ironically, actually, I was in high school. I took a course that was partly electronics, partly computer programming, and I actually dropped out of that course. It's like the only course I ever dropped in high school, and that's what I love to do. It's
code.
Some serious irony on that one, but I didn't really get into it until I was starting my master's project. Mm-hmm. So at the end of my undergrad, I didn't even heard of medical physics before my last year. But I had two friends that were a year ahead of me that were starting in the medical physics program at McGill University, and they told me about it. So I was like, well, I don't really know what I'm going to do after my undergrad, so maybe I'll try that. And I loved it. It was, and that program is pretty tough. Like the first year they're just like, I don't know, slamming you with like information and so many courses. But regardless, I was just like a sponge. I thought it was so cool to like learn about actually, applied, physics in a medical setting too. Like, and being able to like play with machines like a CT scanner where you can actually see inside the patient's body, mm-hmm. right? Or a radiation therapy machine where you can like penetrate a patient and like, deliver, like basically break apart their molecules with radiation to cure cancer. It's just, it was super cool.
Something about opening, because it's like that with computers or medical scanners. When you grow up and everything is a black box, like it's hard to understand anything, and the box starts to become a little bit transparent and you see a little bit inside. And I guess that's super inspirational.
Yeah. So my master's project was on a form of image guided radiation therapy. And that involved lots of programming. So I just kind of had to learn how to code to some degree. And I loved it. I remember actually, so I was sitting in some back room near where they do treatment planning in the clinic. So I was actually in the clinic doing this work at a workstation that had the software I needed to write the code. And there was one of the professors came in, was doing some work there. And I turned to him and I just said, look, I would just do this for the rest of my life if I could get paid a decent salary. I just love this. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I kind of fell in love with like trying to solve these problems with computers. Turns out I'm a really big nerd, but
well, anybody watching this podcast, I know a lot of people come to my channel for tutorial videos and stuff. This should be very inspirational. If if you can take one programming course in undergrad and then learn to code in your master's and, write revolutionary software, that means anybody watching these videos who hasn't or is just starting to learn to code, and maybe they're in their later year of undergrad or they're starting their master's, it is definitely possible. That being said, I think coding, this is a personal belief of mine, it baffles me that it isn't taught more in schools at a younger age. I think if there's any way to get young people motivated about mathematics, physics, and, build things, because kids love to build things, it would be through coding. And there's cost efficient ways to do this now. We have Raspberry Pis that don't sell for, the price nearly as much as a regular computer. What are your thoughts on getting people to start learning to code at a younger age?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, you said I'm young, but I'm actually pretty old. I'm like 50 years old. So I don't really know what they're teaching kids these days in school. But I do feel that you should expose all children to computer programming at a young age. Just to, I don't actually think that, they should be forced to learn it, but I think there are some kids out there that will fall in love with it and learn a lot just by doing it. And as I said, for physics, you're doing problem solving all the time, and that's a really good skill. I think computer programming, if you set up the courses properly, you can also learn those kind of skills. So it doesn't have to be just about the programming. It can also be about math and physics or chemistry or whatever, right? Like you can incorporate that into the education using coding. So, just like your magnet. So think about a much more simple example of your magnet modeling experiment. You could make much more simple things that children could learn. I also think that there's all sorts of great online resources for adults to learn computer programming now. I mean, you've got your own YouTube videos, which are awesome. But I don't see why we couldn't make, and maybe these probably exist, but I would think that children could learn some coding from really high quality educational videos, not just videos, but actual, educational websites where that's interactive, like they just write some code and maybe they're writing code for, I don't know, whatever, a bouncing ball or something like that, right? Under the influence of gravity. And then the kid can, write, just like start from nothing to say like, this is how you make a ball, right? And, with the radius and whatever. And then this is how, like you have the points on the ball, it's a mesh. And then this is how, you introduce like motion of that and then gravity. And then you could just expand it as far as you wanted to, right? And it would be very interactive, right? Like all of the code that they would write would be run, on the website and they would see what was going on. And I mean, it's totally introductory kind of level, but it would be accessible to all children, right, in the world. Because I also think that it doesn't make sense to, I shouldn't say it doesn't make sense. It's better if these tools are available globally in all, every language, because there could be some, genius computer programmer in Bangladesh, some child, right, that's gets access to it on their old, version 2.0 iPad or something and can learn this stuff. And if we like invest in a lot of money to make very good educational content that can be disseminated globally, it's still really efficient.
Yeah, and inspirational. And it shows that, my fear with a lot of the reason why a lot of kids don't like math or they don't like something is because they don't see how it's integrated in practice. And that sort of speaks to how even after developing your code, you still went to the clinic to see it implemented, which I think is so cool. For example, even something with a Raspberry Pi where you could combine literally two completely different settings, like writing code and watering a plant and, measuring the soil humidity or something. And suddenly you have everybody who's really into gardening or something at that young age. And there's probably a big subset of children who love that. and they're seeing its integration with code, and they say, wow, I did not know that mathematics could be used for this. I mean, you hear kids ask questions like, so is math used in physics? Or, it's like they really don't understand the interconnectivity of everything. Or is math used in science? Which I find pretty funny. So that interconnectivity is really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. In terms of your own advice for programmers who are seeking entrepreneurship, what advice do you have for them? Learning,
I guess, yeah, I mean, we're talking a lot about computer programming, and I learned some programming on my own, but like I'm not that good a programmer, right? Like in terms of my code, if I had went to apply for a job at Microsoft and they looked at my code, they would laugh at me and say this is garbage, probably. But my code, it's more for trying to solve a problem. So the code I developed for VMAT, for example, I did go through it, line by line with the developers at VMAT, at Varian, but they just rewrote the whole thing themselves, right? So it was more the algorithms that were important than the code itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So where am I going with this? Yeah. So I think that even if you're the best computer programmer in the world, you need to figure out a problem that needs to be solved, right? You need to, just because you're really good at programming, you could probably get a job anywhere you want, but to actually, if you want to be entrepreneurial, you have to figure out what problems need to be solved, and then of course try to estimate how much, like, what's the probability that you could find a solution to this, right? Because you're not going to know a priori whether you can find a solution. Like it just doesn't happen that way. People aren't just like, oh, there's this problem and I have a solution now and I'm just going to go do it. Like you have to spend so much time to, yeah.
We're used to looking at answer keys. What's the answer key? This problem.
Yeah.
Oh, the answer key. It's like, no, most problems don't have solutions.
I mean, and this podcast, we're talking about VMAT. I mean, there's probably a dozen other things I tried to do in my life that just didn't go anywhere, right? Like having failures is totally fine. In fact, if you don't have failures, then that probably means we're living in a simulation that's designed just for you. Because everybody fails once in a while. There's just a probability that you're going to fail. And if for things that are like high risk, high reward, that means the probability of failure is pretty significant, And I think maybe some people find that difficult to accept, but some of these entrepreneurial activities, there's only a 25% chance of success, but they do it anyway because they know if they do get it right, if it does work, it will be hugely valuable. And that's actually brings me to another point. You need to, before you start working to solve a problem, you have to think about, if I did solve the problem, how much benefit would it really be? Because sometimes you'll say, oh, this is a problem. Like we need to have, this just to like have a device that's capable of doing X. I could think of one example, but we can go there later.
I think I know what your example is, and I think I'm going to ask that next.
And then you'll be like, you'll work really hard, you'll find a solution to it, and then you'll realize that it's not really that important, right? And I think that in a lot of in academia, sometimes that happens. That people, like, there's whole fields of research where people are like studying something, but few people ask the question, okay, imagine if we studied this and it turns out to be like, the most, the results we get are showing that it is more incredible than we could have imagined. What does that mean for, the world, right? Like, is it actually going to help people that much? And I think some people don't always ask that question, and then they'll spend time on something where they really just should have been working on something else.
Yeah. And even if there is a problem, this is something I've encountered myself. If something doesn't work, it's not necessarily just giving up on that problem entirely, but reformulating the question in such a way that maybe there is a solution to a slightly different problem that's still beneficial, and being able to adjust your mission as you face roadblocks as well.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Go ahead.
Moving on, and this sort of goes back to your last point. So even after success of VMAT, you still work, which I think is really awesome because obviously you love to code and develop and build new things. And you're now running a company called Limbus AI. And so from my understanding, at the moment, the main purpose of this company is to perform organ segmentation on CT images. And so this goes to the last point you said, where, you have to ask, suppose we solved the problem and we solved it perfectly. Like, not only did we solve it, we have it down to an art. We know exactly, you give me a coordinate in space and I'll tell you whether it's exactly what organ it is. So that would be the ideal of organ segmentation, is that you step in a scanner and all of a sudden a doctor has access to every location in space, exactly what organ that is. And that's kind of the case right now, but obviously it's difficult. And so my question is, suppose that you could perfectly segment every organ of a patient. What would be the implications in healthcare?
That's a really good question, actually. Nobody's ever asked me that before. I think so. First of all, let's imagine the scenario where we had this new great technology and we could apply it retrospectively, right? So we could take all the scans of patients that had already been treated with radiation and segment all of their organs perfectly. We could go and look at all of the clinical trial patients that were ever CT scanned for radiation therapy. And we could see every single organ, and we could then correlate side effects and outcomes with those perfectly segmented organs. So it would provide us, basically it would reduce the error bars that we have on our on how well patients do, on what kind of side effects they have. So you can estimate a certain probability of a side effect to, let's say, in prostate cancer, the rectum is very close to the prostate and it's a sensitive structure. So sometimes giving it too much dose can lead to nasty side effects. Mm-hmm. But if we can accurately segment the rectum on all of the patients that have been treated with prostate cancer, we can get a much better idea of like how much dose, exactly is too much dose for the rectum to receive, and also like the frequency of the treatment, and maybe the location along the rectum where we usually see more side effects. And that would actually be really good because it would inform us of how to plan patients in the future. So we could really try to avoid certain parts of the rectum more than other parts based on that data.
So you mentioned these error bars, and I'm assuming when you're talking about shrinking the error bars, what I'm assuming you mean by that is that part of the contribution to that error is from non-perfect segmentation.
Exactly. That's what I mean. Exactly. Yeah. Thanks for clarifying that.
Okay.
Yeah. And, one of the problems that our company runs into is the ground truths for our AI training are very hard to come by, in the sense that people, like some organs are easy to segment manually, but other ones are subjective. So you'll get two, experts, maybe radiologists, that will segment an organ and they'll give you slightly different answers, right? Mm. So we don't really know where that organ is if the experts cannot agree. The only way we'd be able to do it is if we, cut the patient open and very thin slices or something like that, like on a cadaver. Mm-hmm. And doing that would be very, very cumbersome. And also, I'm not sure if it's feasible because it's not actually, once the patient is deceased, the scans will look different too. So, mm-hmm. Having the perfect segmentation would be great, but it's also currently impossible because we don't really know what the ground truth is.
So with regards to that, when you're training an AI model, because the AI model is going to predict something and there's disagreement among experts as to what the organ looks like, that places a sort of, I guess, limitation on the AI
Yeah,
model itself.
yeah, that's right.
When you're training the model, do you somehow let it know that there's a disagreement among people in this region, and then the AI learns to be less confident in its predictions there?
Uh, that's a good question too. We don't do that. And I'm just trying to think about whether that would be beneficial or not. I mean, one of the tricky things is that so I think what you're suggesting would be particularly useful if people used a segmentation that was also kind of a probability based segmentation,
Mm-hmm.
right? So we could almost have like the raw output of the neural network, the output of the neural network has it's basically like a confidence of which pixel belongs in which organ.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, if it's something that's easy to see on a CT scan, like a bladder, for example, then it can be very confident. It'll be like 99.9% confident that this one pixel's in the bladder.
Mm-hmm.
But then as you get to the edge, those numbers change, right? So then it goes down to like, 80%, 70%, and then down to 10% and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So you could actually present organs that are probability based to the clinician as well. Right now, it's just like a binary threshold that it's there or it's not at each pixel. That's
Mm-hmm.
what we present to them. Um, and this is kind of a rabbit hole actually, because you could actually incorporate the probability of each pixel being each organ into the dose optimization, into the treatment plan optimization, so
Mm-hmm.
that it would weight pixels that you're confident are an organ, like it would weight the dose to those um, pixels more highly than the ones it wasn't confident to.
Ah, that's really cool. So you're using a okay, okay. And I'm assuming a lot of the low probability is obviously at the edges where, if you're not familiar with
Usually,
image,
usually.
for people watching who aren't familiar with the terminology, what can happen is that if you take a picture which has finitely many pixels, if in reality things have sharp cutoff edges, if a pixel intersects the region where the organ is and the organ isn't, so the pixel maps over the boundary, then you get something called the partial volume effect, where some of the organ is inside the pixel, some of it isn't. And so if you have finite resolution, I guess you can't, the edges can never be perfectly segmented because they truly do belong to both the organ and the outside. Is that something that you would have to deal with when providing these segmentations?
Yeah. Um, we don't really worry about that. I mean, we use a resolution of about a millimeter. Some structures we use half a millimeter. Some of the smaller, like brain structures.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I mean that probably does impact the edge that where we define like the boundary between the structure and not the structure. But um, and I don't know, I think we may have thought of incorporating that into the training as well, but we haven't bothered. I think the problem is that going back to the difference in expert opinion is still the overriding limit to the accuracy. So having partial volume effects at the boundary is not as important. Like it's just already within the margin of error that we're going to see due to variation between different clinicians.
Right. Right. Yeah, see, and I do a lot of SPECT imaging, and there the resolution is quite a bit worse. So we're looking at, sometimes 4 millimeters, 5 millimeter resolution, where those partial
Right.
volume effects really
Yeah, that's more significant, definitely.
can have more of an effect. So in terms of Limbus AI as a company, who are the main, I guess, potential clients you would have in terms of people in the healthcare field who want these organ segmentations?
So it's really the clinicians that are treating the patients that will be using the software. So um, people, when they're doing the planning of patient treatments, as I mentioned, every patient has a different size, shape, position of tumor, and also the healthy tissue structures like the spinal cord or the rectum or the bladder, et cetera, are different for every patient. So in order for us to optimize the radiation dose so it's avoiding those healthy tissue structures, those organs, we need to know where they are, right? And if we want to be within a millimeter, then we need to know where they are within a millimeter. So every patient that has an optimized treatment plan, which is 95% of patients, requires you to segment all of these organs on the images that are used for their planning, and that takes a long time. I mean, it could take hours. Depends on the treatment site, and it depends on how many organs you want to segment, but it can take a really long time. So the benefit with using our software, we can generate the segmentations in a minute, 1 to 3 minutes, depending on your computer hardware. And that is very fast. And it also is just done in the background. So it's not like somebody's waiting for it to happen. As soon as the scan is completed of the patient, our software will automatically pick up the scan, generate the segmentations, and then save those to the treatment planning system. So all that the clinician has to do is review the segmentations, because sometimes the AI fails, right? Or sometimes the clinician will, as I mentioned, have slightly different ideas on where the organ should be. So they will review and make edits if necessary. And depending again on how many structures and how difficult a case it was, it might take 5 to 10 minutes, sometimes less. But that saves them an enormous amount of time when they're doing the treatment planning, so that they can then focus on creating a dose distribution that is conforming to the tumor and avoiding the healthy tissue. So fundamentally, again, it's saving time for the clinician so that they can focus on what's important. And if they can focus on what's important, then the patient's going to get a better treatment.
Right. So it's letting them, it's allowing them to adjust most of their focus on a more important task, as opposed to Yeah.
Well, I guess I shouldn't say like segmentation is important, but now it's taken care of for them. So there's 2 important things: making sure that the organs that are segmented for the treatment plan are done accurately. And then the second part is making sure that you create a plan where the dose is conforming tightly to the tumor and avoiding
which you've already automated. So you're step 1 done. You've already automated the treatment plan, and now comes with the automation of the organ segmentation beforehand. So really you're automating the full process.
It seems to be my theme. It's just to try to make things faster.
Try to make things faster, more optimized, and allow clinicians to, this is a big thing too, right? People don't understand that here in BC, Canada, we have a huge shortage of doctors, and there are multiple reasons for that. I have many friends in med school who are going through this, and they can train about 300, give or take a few, per year. And if you can help these certain fields of medicine or whatever, whoever's being hired at various companies, take less time, you can readjust your resources and allow other areas to not be, neglected, or put more people in those fields.
Right. There's actually a new technology that's being introduced called adaptive radiation therapy. And I'd like to talk a bit about that, because it's an area where automatic segmentation will have a pretty dramatic impact on the quality of the treatments. So adaptive radiation therapy, basically, the idea is to adapt the patient's treatment plan just before they're going to be treated over multiple treatment sessions. Okay. So imagine a patient's going to get, 10 treatment sessions for their whole treatment. They'll have an initial plan that will be generated just how we've described. But when they get to the treatment machine, and when they're lying on the treatment couch, they will take images, a form of CT scan called a cone beam CT, or they could get an MRI. There's some specialized machines that are able to do MRI at the same time. And what they'll do is, based on those images, they will replan the patient's treatment or adjust something about the patient while they're still on the couch waiting for treatment, and do that for every single day of their treatment. So they'll re-optimize the dose distribution every day of the treatment, and thereby allow them to provide a much more, well, not, I don't know how much more, but it depends on the case, but a more conformal radiation dose to the tumor, and again, avoid more of the healthy tissue.
And I guess this just isn't feasible if you have to manually segment the organs every time.
That's exactly right. So if the manual organ segmentation takes you whatever, even if it only took you like 15 minutes, that's too long. But with our software, if we use a high-end computer with a GPU, for pelvis, for example, we can segment the structures that are needed in like 15 seconds.
Wow. Wow. Order of 60 speed up, and no carpal tunnel syndrome from dragging the mouse and segmenting.
It's funny you mentioned that. We actually had feedback from one of our clinics where they said that they have less carpal tunnel syndrome now.
So another positive benefit, another way to benefit the healthcare system is
that's right. Preventative
medicine for the actual treatment planners.
No, that was really nice to hear, actually. I mean, our software is actually used in over 200 clinics globally, for automatic segmentation for Limbus AI. And we actually automatically segment over 250,000 scans a year now, which is a lot, actually.
Wow.
That's a lot of patients.
Wow.
Yeah. So we've been growing pretty quickly, and we've had a lot of very positive feedback from people that have started using our software, and I think things are at a kind of a tipping point now, actually. Like, just the word of mouth from clinicians, once you get to that number of clinics of technology that's extremely useful, it's going to accelerate things for the company, and I suspect things are going to get busy, very busy, very quickly.
Wow. Yeah. Now we spoke earlier about that this idea that if you have a really good idea and you can code it up in an algorithm, and you don't need to be necessarily the best programmer in the world to, as long as you understand the basics of programming and you can code it up, you can get a solution. But even then, there's obviously big steps from taking a model that you have for organ segmentation and putting it and packaging it and adding all these features to it in such a way that it can be put in the clinic. And so what I'll mention is that, a popular website for open source AI stuff it's called MonAI. They provide lots of models for different things in medical imaging. One of the models they have is actually a CT, whole body segmentation. And I looked, and I don't think it does quite as many organs as Limbus. That being said, I have sort of a few questions there. The first would be, what are the steps you have to take to give people confidence where you have a model like that and actually take it from some sort of algorithm to actually put it in the clinic? Like, that to me is such at the moment, a black box.
Yeah, I mean, it's not easy. And I think that at Limbus, I think we had a lot of structures, or enough structures in the human body that we could segment to build a product after a couple of years, maybe late 2019, 2020, but we didn't start getting significant sales until 2022. And it's because there are a lot of other steps you have to do. One of them is you have to build software to just run run the AI models efficiently. And also, you need to have the software so it fits within the clinical workflow, so it doesn't actually increase the workload. So you don't want to have software that somebody has to, every time you CT scan a patient, you have to go in there and then you have to select which organs you want to be segmented, and then you have to select what the names are and the colors of the contours that identify them. You also have to make sure that you can output in the correct formats for whatever treatment planning system that you're going to use. And you want to make sure that it's compatible with all treatment planning systems, because that would limit how many people that could use it. So you really need to build all those other tools as well. And then on top of that, because this is medical software that normally requires regulatory approvals, you have to go through that process as well. So you have to apply for FDA 510K, for example. In Europe, it's CE mark. And those processes are, quite rigorous, and you have to prove that your software is going to perform and be safe. And to do that is quite a bit of work as well, right? They're not going to take your word for it.
So in terms of being safe, one of the dangers, I guess, of, or at least if it wasn't done properly, is if you had an improper organ segmentation. So you don't want to treat the spinal cord, and maybe something from the prostate is put in the spinal cord. Is there a fail safe designed in your software to stop things like that from happening?
Yeah. I mean, the fail safe is that we require all structures that are output from our software to be reviewed by a clinician before they're used on a patient.
And I imagine that requirement made it much easier to get through. Not that it was easy, but easier to get through the FDA and protocol.
I mean, it was an essential part of our product because our safety, our safety and quality, just because we can't guarantee that the AI is going to do a good job every time, right? And it's just so there's no way that we could ever, like, even in a market that might not have regulatory requirements for our product, we would still have that in the software, in the manual, in the splash screen when you start the software. It's always going to be telling you that you have to review these before you use them on humans.
Which it's that human AI interface, I guess, where you're not blind trusting the AI.
But I should clarify that, you can't just, like, let's say I had a terrible AI so a terrible deep neural network that was only trained on like 5 patients, and then I submitted for regulatory approval, but I said, hey, even if they're terrible, the clinician's going to fix them anyway, so it's okay. That would still not be acceptable. You still have to prove that on average, the performance of the neural network is meeting clinical standards.
Right. I'm reminded of that scene, I don't know if you've ever watched The Office, where they're driving a car and it's telling them to turn right as they're driving down a road. And there's a little road that leads into a lake. And it's Michael and Dwight driving. And he's like, don't turn right. He's saying the AI driving thing is telling me to turn right. I'm turning right. And he's like, don't do it. And they end up driving right into the lake. And so I guess you have to, the lesson from that, I guess, is that AI does bias your opinion. If you have a bad model that looks good, maybe it segments something that looks like it could be proper, you still have to have that judgment of the person saying, hey, I know for a fact that the prostate is not in the spinal cord or something like that, and having that.
Yeah. I mean, we actually do have additional processing of our output from the neural network to try to avoid situations like that, to make sure that the organs do make sense. So that does help significantly. Like, it does help avoid some situations that would be bad for the patient. They would probably be picked up by the clinician anyways, but our goal is to make it as fast as possible for the clinician, as easy to use as possible, as reliable as possible.
Yeah.
I mean, an example for that is sometimes there are certain organs where, like spinal cord and brainstem, for example, they're actually they're connected together. Your spinal cord kind of stops and then becomes brainstem. That interface where one starts and the other one stops is a bit subjective. And depending on where you took your CT slice, it might be a little bit above, might be a little bit below. The important thing is that you don't leave a gap in between them. So you could, if you just treated them independently, you could have a gap there. And if you left a gap, you could theoretically have the optimization would think, hey, there's no spinal cord or brainstem here. I'm just going to let there be lots of dose. And by doing so, you could paralyze the patient. So it's important that they're contiguous and they do, one abuts the other. And we make sure of that when we're doing our post-processing of our deep neural network output.
The post-processing of it. Going back to the car analogy, obviously people have a vision of the future of self-driving cars where, no human. There's different levels, I think, where, you know, sometimes you have someone driving and the car is also driving, but you can take control. But then there's also this idea that eventually, you know, you sit in the car and there's no interface between the human and the car whatsoever. It's entirely driving. Now, the reason I bring this up is that for something like CT organ segmentation, the way it is right now is you segment and the clinician double checks and they make adjustments and then they treat. In the long term of things, do you see a world where that doesn't happen, where the AI makes the prediction and it's final? It's so good at what it does that it's trusted completely.
That's a really good question. I don't know. I mean, I think that, I mean, basically you're asking me, could the AI be better than anybody on the planet, right?
Well, it's a combination
Kind
of
of.
that, because it might right now be better than anyone on the planet, but we still want that human check. I guess the
Hmm.
question is, do in something like medicine, do we always want that safety of the doctor or somebody double
Yeah.
checking, or will we ever rely only on AI?
I think that someday we will be comfortable relying on AI for this, like completely. Um, I don't see why not. Like, I believe that AI could, transcend human intelligence. Um, so if that's true, then the AI should also be able to be as good as any doctor on the planet and wouldn't need a second check, just like, the expert doctors.
Okay, so you said something interesting, and I want to kind of push you on this point. You said that AI will someday transcend human intelligence, and that's something I've thought about. If AI is only trained on human output, I wonder this to myself: what is going to let it take that leap where it actually transcends human intelligence? I mean, you can make the argument that some AI models now transcend human intelligence, given that they do things very fast and they can, you know, I but in terms of
Yeah.
that,
Yeah, without going down the rabbit hole of what is intelligence, right? We don't want to go there. So,
yeah, yeah.
but just like whether it, yeah, I mean, I totally agree with what you're saying that, we don't really have more data to train it on than what humans have produced so
Mm-hmm.
far in humanity, right? So that's it. Like there's no more, ChatGPT is trained on the internet, and that's basically everything that humans know. So how is it going to do better? There's not like some magic internet where it can access that has stuff that humans don't know and then get trained and then be smarter than us, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that we're going to have a an advancement in AI where it's not just regurgitating um, word by word based on previous words it's been given, but some way of actually doing some form of quote unquote reasoning. So being able to think about what it's going to say before it says it, and also think about how, if it did say these things, why would it say them? How are they interconnected with each other? Almost like a form of like, okay, it's learned the internet, right? Let's try to compress that knowledge into more basic concepts, right? So figure out how to get a neural network architecture that is able to look at what ChatGPT has learned.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how you do this. I mean, I'm just making stuff up here, but
Take notes,
um,
future programmers. This is your company ideas.
I mean, it could just like start rambling about stuff. You start off with whatever, some keyword, and it would just ramble forever. You like ChatGPT, if you're familiar with it, it'll just, you could just get it to you could ask it, how do you make a tuna fish sandwich? And then like, well, it'll tell you in 3 sentences, and you say, well, tell me more, tell me more, tell me more. And it would just keep going and going forever. Right. Um, and so instead might want to like ask it to, um, you know, tell me, why are you thinking of this? Like, why did you tell me how to make a tuna fish sandwich this way? And then obviously, without actually retraining the neural network, it's going to just get into some kind of loop or hit a dead end. But you need to actually be able to readjust the network weights of ChatGPT as it's kind of reviewing what it's thinking about in a way that kind of is able to, it's almost like data compression, like compress these concepts that it doesn't have any concepts right now. It's just regurgitating stuff, but generate concepts instead of actually regurgitating words kind of not randomly, but just based on whatever neural network output gets. I don't know.
I almost wonder how we would even measure whether or not it's regurgitating versus whether or not it's making reasoning decisions.
But then that's a good question too, I think. And then you have to ask the question, what are humans doing?
I know, that's what I was thinking. I mean, maybe there's someone you don't like and it feels like they're just regurgitating the same thing every day.
I mean,
but still, regardless, humans have innovated in the past. So even if we are just regurgitating the same thing, we as society have made advancements. The question is, how did we go from year 1000 to year 2022? And it sounds like what you were pointing at was asking questions like, why did you tell me to make the tuna sandwich by putting 3 pieces of bread on it? And it says, oh yeah, no, that's not a sandwich. It doesn't fit the mouth or whatever. Something like that. Yeah.
So something along those lines, and I think it may, like, I was thinking about how ChatGPT, you can ask it to review what it did, or, ChatGPT will give you an answer to some question. And then if you ask it to answer the same question again, based on the answer it had just provided you, right? That is now new input to the network it didn't have the first time you asked the question. It will provide you a different answer, and often a better answer. Now that kind of asymptotically gets to, like, some specific answer, but I kind of wonder, and this is really getting out there, but I kind of wonder if that's like some kind of, it's almost a hint of like what's going on in our consciousness. Like in our brains, maybe we have a neural network that's regurgitating something, but we're also reviewing what we regurgitated and feeding it back in to regurgitate out something else, feeding that back in. And it's just kind of like, it could be this just like constant loop of regurgitation, of refinement of what we're regurgitating. And when we're thinking, about stuff, maybe that's what we're doing.
Maybe the more eloquent speakers think when they regurgitate, and maybe the ones who aren't reviewing the stuff, they're just all out.
That's true. Yeah.
You mentioned something where with ChatGPT, and I'll bring this back to Limbus AI. You mentioned with ChatGPT this idea that you have some network input, you ask it a question and it answers it, and then you provide it another question and it has more network input, and then it will update its answer. That seems to me like a huge avenue for organ segmentation, that you could develop a model where you have the initial AI segmenting the organ, and then someone goes in and adjusts those segmentations. Could you then have that same feedback loop with something like a CT organ segmentation?
Yeah, I think you could. You could have like another channel to the input layer of your your segmentation. That is, so right now your input is the image, right? And then the output is the segmentation. But you could have another layer that is a segmentation guess by, I don't know, another neural network, or maybe it's like a partially drawn segmentation by a human. I mean, it could be really anything. That's the kind of beauty of these neural networks. You can feed them any kind of information you want. So yeah, you could imagine like a recursive or not recursive, but repeating loop where it's, segmenting something, and then it sends us that whatever it produced back into the initial layer again, and then send that through and just like, loop over and over until it converges to something.
The question is, that convergence actually means something. So if this AI and human are having this argument where, they're the human segments and then the AI adjusts, and then the human segments again and the AI adjusts, and you're having this interactive process. The question is, one, will that converge? And two, does that convergence actually mean something? Is that actually going to be better?
That's a really good question too. I think, like, in the context of segmentation, I don't think it would provide you that much benefit to provide like the output and then just create a loop where it's reviewing its results.
Mm-hmm.
I think that one pass of the network would be sufficient to capture everything it needs. Like I just think it will have already been trained well enough um, to be kind of aware of what it would have output. That loop is almost like it's not inherent to the network, but it's there. Like it's probably kind of somewhat programmed into its neurons inherently. So maybe ChatGPT, maybe I'd have the same, maybe that argument destroys my argument for ChatGPT, but the ChatGPT is a little different though, because it does provide you with different answers if you ask the same question again after it's provided one answer.
Yeah.
And it usually gets better. It's able to clean up its mess. So, for computer programming, you can ask it to write a program to do, I don't know, whatever, to write a computer program that will train a neural network for organ segmentation. And then you'll look at the output and you'll say, well, this part of it is wrong. It's not going to work. And then they're like, oh yeah, sorry, I made a mistake. Now, and it's very apologetic, very, nice to work with. And then it will fix that. And usually it might not get it perfectly right, but it definitely improves it over its last pass. So you ask yourself, why didn't it get it right the first time? Right? Like there's something going on there.
Or is it just that it could be this human bias that we have where, sometimes it does get it right the first time and we ask it and it corrects itself. And so we believe like this could be a beautiful marketing scheme by them if this is what's being done, but it's more likely to get the answer the more times you ask it. So it sounds like it's improving, but really it's just taking a gamble each time. And then in the process, you're saying, wow, this software is actually capable of learning based on these responses. But in reality, maybe it's just trying something else and saying, well, what about this? He said, wow, you learned from my response.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not sure. Have you asked ChatGPT to explain something like VMAT before?
I did. Yes. Just for fun. And that was, it gave me a very nice answer. So I asked it to explain VMAT to me in the style of a Snoop Dogg rap song.
How it should be explained, by the way.
Yes. I'm not sure if Snoop Dogg was really. Yeah, no, he was around when VMAT first came out. Yeah,
have you contacted him yet about setting up the lyrics for this song?
No, I mean he keeps contacting me for stuff for projects, but I just no,
just never worked out.
but actually the VMAT rap song was brilliant. It actually described it quite accurately and it rhymed. And I don't know, there must be some AI program to generate someone singing a song. You just write the lyrics. I need to feed that into that AI to do it because there's no way I'm going to sing it.
Well, not yet. Maybe they'll bring you to the clinic and it will inspire them if you sing a little song. I don't know.
That's right.
So in other like sort of modern things that just came out, I guess Apple just released these new goggles. I think they look kind of silly, but I think there's potential for them, especially maybe in things like healthcare where, if you could look at something, for example, organ segmentation, for example, and you maybe you look at a patient and you can see things. Did you see the commercial for these?
I did.
Yeah,
I did. They look cool. I mean, they look kind of dumb on somebody's head, but I mean, the capabilities look pretty cool. And yeah, I think in terms of using them for different applications, I think applications where your hands are not available to hold a phone or, control something else, that would control your video, it will be quite useful, like surgery, for example, or if you're working on machinery where you have to use both your hands. I think that will be quite useful, like quite, practical. However, I actually bought the Oculus Rift several years ago.
Yeah.
And I played some games on it and tried it for a couple of different things, but it pretty quickly went into the drawer in my closet and I have not taken it out since.
Well, it seems like it would sort of induce a headache. You got this big thing on your head and You didn't get nauseous from it or anything?
Some people did. I was okay, but yeah, I could see how you might get nauseous. But I think I just you have so this is I think one of those situations where you're like, wow, this would be cool if you could just put this thing on your head and wherever you looked, you could overlay stuff on your, current environment. Um, Obviously doing that is like technically it's just amazing that they can do that. It's really neat technology, but you have to ask yourself how really let's say we did it really well. How useful is this going to be? Like how much is it actually bringing that we don't already have, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like how hard is it to, let's say you want to watch a movie, right? How hard is it to sit down at your TV and watch a movie and then not have this thing on your head at the same time, right? So that, you know, you can, do other stuff, or if you have to go to the washroom, you have to like unplug it or something, or
Mm-hmm.
it's just, is it actually providing that much better quality of the movie? I don't know. And then also like responding to text messages or having video calls, and like, do you really need to have like a huge, screen of the person you're looking at in a FaceTime? I don't know, like maybe, but is it worth it? Is it that important that you'd want to put this whole thing on your head? And it's like 3,600 US dollars or something.
Yeah.
It's pretty expensive.
I saw the
So
cost,
yeah.
and I immediately thought that something like this could be more advantageous, less in like this. They seem to be sort of marketing towards personal use, and
Mm-hmm.
I immediately thought of something like healthcare and something like yeah, for example, you mentioned surgery and using it to assist you in those sorts of things, where the cost is certainly more feasible for these organizations, but yeah, also in
Yeah.
terms of I mean, we're already attached to our phones. Do you really want texts coming up and your whole world now literally becomes you know digital?
Yeah. I just think it's just hard to beat the phone, right? Like
Yeah.
it fits in your pocket easily. You can bring it everywhere. It does pretty much anything, right? Like you
Mm-hmm.
can watch videos, listen to music, surf the internet, check email, watch Python YouTube videos, it's pretty amazing. It's hard to imagine a device, considering that, that we're human beings, and we can't, if we could have something that was like, in our brain, that was, we could just like flip to the internet and it would just, instead of looking out, so if we could have the same thing but we didn't have to put this thing in our head, people might use it more.
Yeah,
uh
that kind of scares me too, though.
yeah, we don't want to have our brains hacked,
I
I
don't want to
guess.
be a hacker who's like flashing awful things that I don't want to see necessarily.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess I'm kind of skeptical, having had the Oculus Rift, and also, Google Glass. I don't know if you remember that, the Google Glasses. Yeah, they had some similar kind of concept, not nearly as nice, but that was, they only had, I don't know, they had a small number of people try them out and they didn't like them apparently. And then Facebook had their own machine, and I don't think that's done very well.
Mm.
So we'll see. I mean, if Apple can make it so it's worth using, then good for them.
Well, this is, I guess, what you speak to when you talk about taking risks, and these are big risks for these companies, and
Mm-hmm.
seeing where they go and seeing if they fail. Um, just wrapping up here, in terms of speaking to new programmers, which is probably the majority of my audience, in terms of your life experience as someone who's been very successful in implementing software in a way that's really used in the real world, what advice do you have to these people?
I guess, if you want to be successful, you have to solve a problem. And I talked about this already, but I'm going to reiterate. You need to solve a problem. And to do that, you have to figure out what the problems are, right? And sometimes, and usually, the problems are not obvious, or at least the obvious problems, there's already tons of people working on it, and you're not going to necessarily want to compete with all those other people. So what you need to do, I think, is figure to focus on some area of the world, some area of industry. Could be medicine, could still be in computers, could be, I don't know, farming, doesn't really matter. but you're going to need to like educate yourself to a pretty high degree to understand what problems there are in that particular industry. You're not going to be able to just walk in there and in a couple of months say, hey, I see this as a problem. I can solve it. So there will be some time investment, I think. So even if you've got great programming skills, you've got to invest the time in learning something outside of computer science to do that. Now, I guess there are examples of people that immediately, so if you're in computer science, maybe you can try to solve a computer science specific problem because you are already in that area. I guess that might be a shortcut, but then you have to realize you're competing against all the other computer science people in the world. So as part of that, finding a niche, it can be really useful as well. Like finding an area where there isn't too much competition. Like I'll be the first to admit, I don't, if I can find a space where I can do something useful and there's less competition, I will go into that space. Mm-hmm. It's just more efficient, better use of my time if I'm not like coming up against a whole bunch of other people trying to do the same thing.
And the trade-off is that, you have to learn about something really well. So for example, farming. You're great at coding, but you want to make an innovation in farming. You can't just be programming. You have to really learn about the domain.
That's exactly right. Yeah. I mean, there may be ways around that, but for me, as I mentioned, I can computer program, right? I can use programming to solve problems, but first I had to figure out what the problem is I needed to solve. So that was probably more important than the programming itself. I was in the field for, I'd say, like 5 years before, I came across that problem and decided it could potentially be solved.
Right. Yeah. Well, I appreciate you taking the time today to have this conversation. I look forward to seeing where Limbus AI goes in terms of organ segmentation. And I wish you all the best.
All right. Yeah. Thank you very much. It was great talking to you.